Thank you for joining us for 3Bs on the Law podcast, hosted by Trisha Barita, Camille Canali, and Susan Dawson. Disclaimer, this podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, not meant to provide legal advice, and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Also, remember, laws change or they differ by jurisdiction, so this is not a substitute for seeking legal counsel in your jurisdiction on the current law applicable to you.
Hello and welcome to this episode of 3Bs on the Law. I'm Susan, the Illinois and Wisconsin B.
I'm Trisha, the Texas B.
And I'm Camille, the California B.
So on this episode, we thought we'd chat a little bit about the different challenges that franchisee owners face as opposed to those standalone businesses. A lot of times we're talking about businesses and business owners and we don't acknowledge or talk about, how franchisees sometimes face very different challenges or have additional layers of complications that they're making. So we thought we'd just talk a little bit about it today and have a conversation about some of those issues and some of the things that we see. So, Camille, you were saying when we were getting ready for this episode that some of the challenges that you come to mind about franchisees.
And so I also want to point out every state, I think, as probably comes as no surprise to people by now, has different laws that affect franchisors and franchisees. So make sure you pay attention to those. But I think the two big ones that I think of are a lot of times franchisees don't realize that they are required to defend and indemnify the franchisor in any litigation, period. And the other part of it is a lot of times the franchisor will give the franchisee very specific instructions about how to either present the product. Like if you're, making sandwiches, they want their sandwiches made a specific way. They will give you great instructions about how to, prepare everything to do the sandwiches, but they don't give guidance on the employment side of things and the trainings that are required on the employment side of things. And that's for a specific reason. The franchisor doesn't want to be involved and doesn't want to be responsible. So when I think of franchise agreement, those are kind of the two big ones that I think a lot of franchisees don't really recognize.
Okay, so I have some other ones I would add to your list, Camille, if you don't mind.
Oh, there's tons of them.
I think those are great ones. I think, obviously if I represent like a ton of like different franchisees and so many different little industries. And I wasn't until I like really had met one of the type of people, there's like a consultant type of person that takes people that want to buy one of these and connects them with the right one. And they'll go through this whole process. And I had not even realized like the extent of the different types of franchisee, franchisors there are out there in the industries. And a lot of people from my experience are getting into this looks like a good fit. They've done all the models of where the location's going to be. And they get into a business they're not that familiar with. So they are a little overwhelmed. Like maybe they've never run a fast food joint, right? So then they end up buying, and they're under like all the things that you said, Camille, right? Like with all these specifics on how to create and basically keep the standards up of what the product is going to be or the service or something. But the other thing is that they run into sometimes like these very specific requirements, I think, related to like geography that are in those agreements, because those agreements can be really big. And I'll talk about like, where are their boundaries? And they can immediately run into like non-compete issues. They have, usually you'll see that there's specific boundaries. And in my experience, sometimes those provisions are written so differently. Like they may think, okay, I'm allowed to, service anyone. Say you're like a Molly Maids or something. And you're like, I'm going to service, this geographic boundaries. Well, if I get a call from somebody outside, I should be able to go service them too, because I didn't go solicit them. They directly came to me. But how does that really work? Because some franchisee agreements and franchisor agreements will say, no, you got to stay in that geographic boundary. And all of a sudden you like walked yourself into some sort of tiff with the neighboring franchisee. And then also like transfer provisions, like understanding that you can't just like sell that. That is a big deal to follow all those transfer provisions. So before you get into like even doing this, understanding how you get out is like a big piece, I think, because sometimes it's not going to be easy if you haven't shown that it's profitable in that area to sell that. And you're going to have to follow all the steps that the franchisor sets in that agreement. And it can make a big deal because you may owe penalties. You may have to meet all these qualifications in order to do that. There may be time restraints. And so I think kind of really understanding sort of like the termination provisions of it. I know that's like nobody wants to talk about the breakup, but I think it's important. I would add that. I know, Susan, you were talking about, which was, I totally agree with them as well. But I want to hear your thoughts about like the things that aren't in the agreement, the things they're not getting help from the franchisor, you know?
Right. Yeah. There's, I think you go into this thinking, like you said, sometimes if you're just buying a franchise for the first time, you think there's going to be all this support from the franchisor because you do hear about all these rules and, what you have to follow. And then you start running the business and realize they're not going to give you all, like everything, right? Just like you said, Camille, go get your own employee handbook. We're not going to provide that to you. Or, there's different resources that aren't provided and it can be a challenge. I completely agree with you, Trisha. When I have someone who comes to me about, hey, can you review this franchise agreement? I'm thinking about joining, going into the franchise. The one thing I always tell them is the first thing you should look at is how do you get out of it? Because they can make it so hard and so painful to get out. I've had a lot of clients successfully sell. Yes, you're right. There's a lot of steps to it, but it's different if you just want to shut down. That is very hard. If you just say, I'm out. That is not, you can't just be done. Right. So it's really being aware of what they are and aren't going to provide you. And one thing that I find that people are very surprised by is how hard it is to get financing for a franchisee. There are banks that won't lend to franchisees. They're just not set up for that. And there are other banks that, there's a few banks that they do quite a lot of franchisee work, but I think people are always surprised that different banks don't know what to do with franchisees because they really are a different animal. It's not really a fully independent business. You may own assets, but you may also just basically be licensing assets from the franchisor. What do you own? What is it that the bank's going to actually be able to collateralize, right, to give you that financing? So there's just a lot of different things to consider when you're going into a franchise situation. Be aware that you might not have as much support. A lot of the ones that a lot of the franchisees that I work with, they have groups, right? Like they might have even an annual conference, right, where they all come together, but they a lot of times these franchisees will come together in little regional groups and maybe provide each other with support. So that's, I found to be for the businesses that I work with that are franchisees, to be a good source of where you can go for support, because you can't always get it from the franchisor.
Yeah. So I think, that's such a good point, because like the thing is that they're not all made the same. You do kind of think I'm going to get this sort of step by step of how to do this business. So I think you're almost like, some people when they get into, owning, and some that own franchises, they end up owning more than one because that's how you make the profit, but like when you're getting into it, you really want to ask those questions about like, what kind of support are you going to get? Because I'm going to say, like, I want to say almost all of them are not heavy into employment law support. Like, they usually are not stepping into that role. And there's a reason for that, is that there's been a lot of case law, which we won't get into, about the arguments about whether franchisors are going to be joint employers with the franchisees. And so they've all your franchisors are getting their own advice on how involved they should be with what's going on with your employees. So what that means, and Camille had brought this point up, is that your state laws and your federal laws related to employment law, that liability is often going to fall on you. And even worse, if you screw that up, if you don't get the employment law stuff right, if you don't have those policies in place to be in compliance, you may actually be involved with any sort of liability for the franchisor most of the time. Wouldn't you say that, Camille?
Yeah, I think that especially in California, the control issue and how much control the franchisor has over the franchisee directly affects the liability that the franchisor might have. But at the same token, and as I was saying kind of before, the franchisor usually recognize this, and that's why they have the franchisee defend and indemnify them, which means you need to make sure the franchisor is an additional insured on your policy. I mean,
yes.
I talk about insurance a lot because it's a big deal. It protects your business. And so that's another thing, that everybody should make sure of, is that their franchisor is named on their policy to protect them both.
Yeah, you don't have the insurance in place like Camille's talking about with that extra protection, and actually understanding that because non-indemnities are all not, and defense or provisions are not all written the same, and making sure that you've actually run that by whoever's handling your insurance and doing the additional insured, because you may have the additional insured, but if you don't have everything in place that's matching the provisions, then you can still get in hot water. And I mean, it can be devastating. You could lose your business really not having the right insurance in place. So that's a great point, Camille.
Yeah, I guarantee you the indemnity clause is not going to favor the franchisee.
Right.
Almost guarantee you.
Can we just agree the whole franchisor agreement is not gonna be favorable to the franchisee?
And they're not negotiable, right? You take them as they are. So
you're like, I want a Chick-fil-A. Let me sign over my firstborn child, or whatever. Nothing against the Chick-fil-A, right? But you know what I mean? These are right. Especially the more established franchisors have so much power in the negotiating strategy. They're just, those agreements are gonna have been gone over with the fine-tooth comb to make sure that every loophole is closed and the franchisee is bearing most of the burden, which can be a lot when you're first starting out and owning one of these. So making sure you understand it. And then I think just, you don't put that, we always talk about this, but that agreement, this isn't like you starting your own business and you created some agreement with your original partners or people that you're in business with. You have an ongoing relationship with that franchisor. So that agreement needs to be, you need to know where it is, and you need to be able to access it to make sure that you're aligned with what they're asking you to do, because there can be very, very, some are much more, strict, like Camille was saying about how you're creating things, and some may be a little more gray. But I think knowing the difference between the two can make a big difference in how successful you are in actually doing business as that franchisee. I wish we could be sitting here telling you it's all like a ready-made, 1, 2, 3, you pop open that business, they tell you how to make that burger, and you're going to be a millionaire. I wish that that's how it is. It just seems to me in my relationships with franchisees, they're always shocked with how much they don't have guidance on, and how much they have to supplement that in, and to not ignore it until it's too late. So
yeah, they're profitable, which is why people continue to buy them most of the time, but you just got to realize what you're getting into.
Agreed.
Great. So lots to talk about, lots to consider if you're thinking about going into a franchise, or buying your own franchisee, or becoming a franchisee, I should say. So I think we kind of went through it, right, everyone? So lots to consider, but thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on 3Bs on the Law.
Thank you for joining us on today's podcast of 3Bs on the Law. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our podcast. We also welcome any comments. If you'd like to get in touch with us or suggest a future topic, you can email us at 3THREEBsonthelaw@gmail.com. And because we're lawyers, we need to remind you that this podcast is not meant to provide you with legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.